Tell me if any of this sounds familiar. The wealth gap is growing. There's rampant poverty. The standard of living is drastically changing. Politicians can't be trusted because of their ties to corporate interests. The news is hard to trust because of its ties to corporate interest. You have so many people living in the bottom rung of society, watching incredible wealth generation that seems to only be going to the very richest people. If any of that sounds familiar, I'm sorry that you happen to live in the 2020s with me, but I'm trying to talk to you about the Gilded Age. I think the Gilded Age is one of the most fascinating times in history because it so closely mirrors a lot of events that are happening now. Rapid changes in technology, increasing wealth gaps, drastic changes in standard of living, all that stuff. But one of the most fascinating things about the Gilded Age is it set up the foundation for the modern world. This was when the United States was on its rise, was becoming the powerhouse that it is today. And there's so many fascinating things that happened in the Gilded Age, and I really think that anyone interested in history should definitely take a dive into it. Like, it's hard to find really good stuff on YouTube about the Gilded Age. There's quite a few videos out there that are like decent primers of the time, but there's not a real good in-depth dive. And so got to resort to books. So I want to talk about two very good primers for the Gilded Age that lead you down the rabbit hole. They have fantastic bibliographies in the back. And then I want to talk about two very, very niche Gilded Age interests of mine at the end. So let's just talk about them real quick. I already flashed it on the screen. The Republic for Which It Stands, the United States during Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, 1865 to 1896. As a quick aside, I know that the Gilded Age is named after the book Mark Twain co-wrote called The Gilded Age. That was a satire of the era, and I haven't read it yet. I know I need to, but I just haven't felt like it. I'd rather read about the actual history. And then I can read about Mark Twain's bias about the era. Get a little knowledge under my belt before I get the programming from the fiction. The Republic for Which It Stands is fantastic. It's so in-depth. It's so well written. My book just fell apart on me as I opened it, so that's cool. Maybe don't buy the trade paperback, buy the hardcover or an ebook or something. But it's got cool pictures, so, got that going for it, which is nice. But one of the most important things it has, and I've never really seen this in another book, especially of its size, it has a bibliographical essay, and it just talks about all their sources, why they used them. Just the bibliographical essay in the back is a fantastic way to take a deep dive into the Gilded Age. Speaking of a deep dive into the Gilded Age, if you've read The Republic for Which It Stands, which has an amazing audiobook I need to add before I move on, you should definitely pick up a copy of The Gilded Age. This is a first edition. There's a second edition. I just picked this one up because it was like $5 on eBay. And the second edition is like $65 because it's still a textbook used today. So this isn't really a textbook so much as it is a bunch of essays about the era. And so the great thing about this is it covers all sorts of really interesting topics. It talks about public life. It debunks some things that I even mentioned in the intro, like these crooked politicians that are working for corporate interests. It talks about a lot of the politicians at the time that were only politicians because they were trying to better the lives of their constituents. Like, a lot of them didn't want to be politicians. They hated it. So that was refreshing to read when you think about like the jaded look at the Gilded Age that you get from other sources. It's interesting to see the good side, some of the people that really cared. And it talks about the life of immigrants when they came over, because the increase in population in the United States during that time was meteoric. And so it's really interesting to read about their lives and how it affected them to come to this country at that time. And yeah, that book is just fantastic. The Gilded Age, Essays on the Origins of Modern America. Highly recommend it. Those are the two books that I think if you want to learn about the Gilded Age, you should definitely start with. And then if you have hyper niche interests like I do, you might want to check out these next two. The Buffalo Soldiers. I read this for Black History Month last year. The author, William H. Leckie, who I was confused because I thought it was the Leckie that wrote a World War II memoir, and it was not, but he also happens to be a historian. William Leckie served in World War II in the Air Force, and afterwards he worked with Black soldiers and was just blown away by the level of racism and mistreatment towards those soldiers. And that was actually a huge inspiration for him taking the deep dive into this research and writing this book. it's just great. It's about the Buffalo Soldiers, and it takes place during the Gilded Age. Like after the Civil War, any black soldiers that wanted to stay in the army were put into the 9th and 10th cavalry regiments and were shipped off to the Southwest. Hey, go fight Native Americans. It should be fine, I guess. And it sucked. Their living standards were awful. The things they had to do were just grueling journeys through the American Southwest to protect these new towns and the growth we had down there. There were a lot of amazing heroes, and they talk about them in this book and the fact that they never got the recognition they deserved. Some of them I read about after I finished this book, they didn't get recognized until like the 1990s. And it's like, how messed up is that? I mean, these people were heroes and they were protecting the American dream, but being treated terribly. Like it talks about how a Buffalo Soldier straight up got murdered in the middle of a town by some white cowboy, and the guy never even got charges pressed against him. He got arrested, and then the town rioted because the sheriff had the audacity to arrest a guy for murder. How is this even possible? And it just gives you a greater understanding of what these guys were living through while serving the people that treated them that way. So I highly recommend this. It's such a great deep dive into the history of the Buffalo Soldiers, and happens to take place during the Gilded Age. So it's fantastic. Gives you just another perspective on that era in history. The last one, Oldtime Baseball, America's Pastime in the Gilded Age. Now, funny thing about this, my wife bought me this book. She saw it at the library sale and picked it up and was like, I think you'll like this. And I looked at it and I was like, oh, cool, Oldtime Baseball. Yeah, I'll get to it eventually. And I put it on the shelf. I didn't think about it again. And then last year, when I was doing my Gilded Age project, where I just take a deep dive into one of my interests for a few months, I was sitting on the edge of my bed. I just finished another book and I needed something else to read because I wasn't sleepy yet. And I was just looking down at my books and I was like, maybe I'll read a baseball book. You know, it's getting close to baseball season. I like to read baseball books around the time the season starts. Kind of gets me amped up. I'm listening to team previews from Effectively Wild, my favorite baseball podcast. And I want to read a baseball book and just be ready for opening day. So I picked this one up off my shelf and I was like, oh crap, this is America's Pastime in the Gilded Age. Like, this is perfect. This kills two birds with one stone. And it's really good. It's just a deep dive into baseball during the Gilded Age. It's great. Yet again, just like Buffalo Soldiers, you're getting to see that era of history from a different perspective. I think that doing these little dives into very specific things has always helped me get a greater understanding of a time in history that I'm researching. And, you know, I'm not researching this to do anything with it. I just like to learn. Of course, I always pick a section in history that no one ever talks about or is really hard to find good books on. And that's one of the reasons I ended up making this video. But yeah, you get to see the Gilded Age from these baseball players' perspective. It just talks about just kind of how they went along with their lives during it. I thought that this would be a fun way for me to kind of talk about a few of these books and maybe get some of you interested in reading about a time in U.S. history that you never see anyone talk about it. I know there's a new show called The Gilded Age, that drama. And I do want to watch that because that seems interesting, because it's like, I'm down for a historical drama that takes place during my favorite time in history. All right, let's do it. So I might get into watching that. But the problem is I end up not finishing shows because I just revert back to reading. That's it for me. If you liked this, I got plenty of other videos about weird books no one else reads. So check those out. Let me know if any of you are interested in the Gilded Age in the comments, and I'll see you next time.